This is a murder investigation. This is a suspected murder. Lynette Hooker is no longer missing and, a criminal investigation.
The Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norville is moving through the water right now. Its hull slicing through the Sea of Abaco with a purpose that should make everyone watching this case stop and take notice. This is not another routine patrol, and it is not a symbolic effort to comfort a grieving family. Federal authorities have officially shifted this entire operation into a suspected murder investigation, moving quietly but with an intensity that suggests the clock is running out for Brian Hooker. For weeks, the public was led to believe this was a tragic maritime accident. A narrative carefully spun around a stalled dinghy, a lost kill key, and a sudden, violent wave that supposedly swept Lynette Hooker into the dark ocean. But the arrival of a 154-foot military-grade vessel in Bahamian waters changes everything we thought we knew about this case. This isn't the local authorities working a missing persons file anymore. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, known as CAIS, has taken full operational control, and they have brought specialized dive teams, remote underwater vehicles, and a highly trained cadaver dog named Maggie to search specific, targeted coordinates. They're looking for something very precise, and according to sources close to the investigation, they're focusing heavily on the deep channels around Tulu Cut, looking for a missing pink dive weight belt that was notably absent from the couple's sailboat. Think about that for a moment. If this was a tragic accident where a woman simply drifted away, why is a federal agency using military assets to scan a 40-foot deep underwater pocket? The implications of this shift are massive, and it is where things get serious for everyone trying to understand what actually happened on the night Lynette disappeared. To understand why these dive teams have been sent back with such urgency, we have to look at the sudden and dramatic escalation in Brian Hooker's legal strategy. Sources have now confirmed that Brian has replaced his original attorney from Michigan with a high-powered defense lawyer who happens to be a former Department of Justice prosecutor. Ask yourself why a man who claims to be a grieving, cooperative husband would suddenly need a lawyer with deep expertise in federal criminal litigation. It suggests that Brian knows the federal government is building a case that goes far beyond local maritime borders. The Coast Guard has asserted jurisdiction because the alleged crime is suspected to have occurred aboard the Soulmate, a sailboat flagged and registered in the state of Florida. Under federal law, a United States vessel remains under American criminal jurisdiction regardless of what foreign waters it happens to be floating in. This legal reality has allowed federal agents to bypass much of the usual international red tape, enabling them to seize the Soulmate, tow it into dry dock, and begin processing it as an active homicide scene. While the public watched the shoreline, investigators were quietly downloading the digital footprint of that boat. The official story Brian provided to rescuers was that Lynette fell overboard from their small tender, leaving him stranded without propulsion for 9 agonizing hours before he miraculously washed ashore. But the federal government now possesses something that completely dismantles that timeline. They have the hard, unyielding reality of satellite GPS data. Stay with me, because this is where the entire alibi begins to fracture under the weight of objective physics. The GPS tracking recovered from the vessel shows that during the exact hours Brian claimed to be drifting helplessly at the mercy of the wind and current, the boat was actually making deliberate, calculated movements. An unpowered dinghy does not navigate into specific channels against the tide. It floats blindly until it strikes a reef or a beach. The data reportedly shows the vessel entering areas of the Sea of Abaco that make no sense for a man in a panic searching for his missing wife. Furthermore, investigators have mapped the precise battery life of the dinghy's electric motor. If you run those engines at full throttle to reach a specific destination quickly, the battery drains exponentially faster than if you are idling. By cross-referencing the remaining battery capacity with the satellite location logs, federal agents have established a tight, chronological window of opportunity. The narrative of the helpless, marooned husband is being systematically replaced by a digital map of calculated intent. It is highly suspected that the violence did not take place on the open water where anyone in the nearby harbor could hear a scream or see a struggle. The working theory driving these new dive operations is that Lynette Hooker died below deck on the Soulmate, a confined space where the walls stifle sound and the dark hides everything from the outside world. This brings us to the chilling surveillance footage captured at a Marsh Harbor boatyard at exactly 3:35 on Easter morning, just hours after Lynette supposedly vanished into the dark. The local media reported basic details about this tape, but when you look closer at the actual behavior documented on that video, it paints a deeply unsettling picture. Brian Hooker does not run into that boatyard screaming for help. He does not show the frantic, breathless panic of a man whose soulmate has just been swallowed by the sea. Instead, the footage shows him strolling up casually, wearing a patterned shirt, dark shorts, and slides. He walks along the perimeter fence, casually waving his hands and calling out for assistance in a calm, conversational voice. My sources describe his demeanor on that tape as eerie and completely disconnected from the gravity of the situation he claimed to be experiencing. But there is one specific detail in that footage that has caught the absolute attention of federal investigators. In his left hand, as he walks through the shadows of the boatyard, Brian is clearly holding a dark, tablet-like electronic device. He wanders around the structures, looking behind objects, checking his watch repeatedly as if he is waiting for a specific time to elapse. Yet, when the volunteer rescue teams finally arrived a short time later to pick him up, that dark tablet was nowhere to be found. It was not in his hands, and it was not visible among his immediate belongings. Where did that device go in the span of those few unmonitored minutes? Did it contain the coordinates of where he had just been? Was it slipped into the yellow, dry bag he carried, away from the eyes of the rescuers? This is the moment where we have to pause and ask what you believe happened in those dark, missing hours between the final sighting of Lynette and the moment Brian walked into the light of that security camera. Do you believe a grieving husband acts with that level of casual precision, or does that video reveal a man executing a very specific timeline? The contrast between his public statements and his documented behavior is exactly why the community is demanding answers, and I want to hear your thoughts on this specific piece of evidence in the comments below. If you believe this investigation deserves national attention and that Lynette's family deserves the absolute truth, please take a brief second to share this video and subscribe to the channel as we follow every breaking development from the dive teams in the Bahamas. The reality of this case is that the truth is rarely simple, but the facts possess a weight that cannot be ignored. The federal authorities are not returning to the water based on a hunch. They are returning because the digital evidence, the behavioral anomalies, and the missing forensic pieces are all pointing to the exact same deep water channels. This story is rapidly accelerating, and as the Margaret Norville drops its anchors near Tulu Cut, the facade of a tragic accident is completely washing away, leaving behind the dark, unmistakable outline of a federal homicide investigation. The arrival of the Broward County Sheriff's Office cadaver dog, Maggie, back in the Bahamas marks a psychological turning point in this investigation that Brian Hooker's defense team cannot easily dismiss. For those unfamiliar with the capabilities of highly trained forensic K9s, it is easy to assume that a standard rainstorm or the vastness of the ocean can wash away the truth. But Maggie is not a typical search animal. She possesses the documented capability to detect the molecular scent of human decomposition rising through 30 feet of salt water. When a body is submerged, it releases microscopic cellular oils that naturally migrate toward the surface, creating a faint chemical signature that is imperceptible to human senses, but acts as a beacon for a specialized handler. The federal authorities have deployed Maggie not only to scour the dense, rocky underbrush along the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor, but also to sit on the bow of a rigid inflatable boat as it weaves through the shallow flats and mangrove channels. This specific shoreline, located just south of the boatyard yard where Brian claimed he drifted ashore, was completely skipped during the initial, chaotic search weeks ago. Back then, volunteers were looking for a living woman who might have crawled out of the surf. Today, federal agents are tracking the specific topography of a crime scene. They are operating on the assumption that if Brian used the dinghy to transport a body under the cover of darkness, he would have sought out the closest, most isolated point of land that could be reached within his tight electric battery window. Think about that detail for a moment and ask yourself why the geography of this specific shoreline matters so much to the federal government. To understand his movements, investigators have begun digging deeply into Brian's employment history, uncovering a pattern of behavioral manipulation that completely strips away his public persona. Documents have revealed that Brian was previously fired from his position at AT&T for a highly sophisticated form of corporate deception. He was caught repeatedly and intentionally jiggering with the hardware of the GPS tracking device installed on his company work van. His goal was simple: to completely disguise his physical location from his supervisors so he could operate without oversight, creating false digital trails that made it appear as though he was on duty at specific job sites when he was actually miles away. His former coworkers described him as an aggressive, deeply manipulative individual who went out of his way to make the lives of those around him a living hell, frequently trying to co-opt other employees into his schemes against the company. This isn't just a piece of old gossip. It is a critical piece of behavioral evidence for federal prosecutors. It demonstrates that long before Brian ever stepped foot onto the sailboat Soulmate, he possessed a proven, technical comfort with manipulating electronic location data to cover his tracks. When a man with a documented history of tampering with tracking systems suddenly claims that his boat's electronic logs are just showing a random, accidental path, the credibility of that excuse completely disintegrates. This brings us directly to the physical condition of the vessel that sits at the center of this alleged cover-up. While the Coast Guard cutter scans the deeper channels, local Bahamian authorities have maintained custody of the 8-foot tender, keeping it locked inside a secured impound yard. Federal investigators are desperately pushing for immediate access to this smaller boat, but they are fighting against a ticking clock that is entirely controlled by nature. Over the 7 weeks since Lynette disappeared, the Bahamas has experienced heavy, repeated tropical downpours. Because the dinghy has been stored in an open-air lot, exposed to the elements, millions of gallons of rainwater have flooded its hull, potentially washing away the vital trace evidence, microscopic biological fibers, or scent markers that Maggie needs to alert on. Yet, forensic experts know that water does not always erase everything. In a violent struggle, blood, hair, and tissue can become trapped in the microscopic ridges of fiberglass, under the rubber, gunnels, or within the intricate wiring of the electric motor housing. The urgency surrounding the search of this dinghy is immense because it represents the physical bridge between the sailboat where Lynette is believed to have died and the open ocean where her body is suspected to have been deposited. If investigators can recover even a single strand of DNA or a matching fiber from that tender, it destroys the defense's argument that the boat was merely an innocent vessel drifting blindly through the night. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative shifts from technical data to a devastating history of domestic volatility that the public was never supposed to see. Behind the curated, sun-drenched images of the couple's sailing lifestyle lay a hidden record of severe physical abuse that Lynette had been desperately documenting for months. Written records, text messages, and statements provided by close friends reveal that Lynette had repeatedly reached out for help, describing instances where Brian would fly into uncontrollable rages below deck. On multiple occasions, she told confidants that Brian had choked her to the absolute point of losing consciousness, an incredibly dangerous form of domestic assault that statistically serves as the single highest predictor of eventual homicide. During one of these terrifying encounters, Brian allegedly leaned over her and whispered a chilling promise that now haunts this entire investigation: "I should have finished the job." Lynette was so terrified during these episodes that she took photographs of her own body, capturing images of a deeply bruised and scraped back. She sent these photos to a close friend along with a text message explicitly detailing the mechanism of the injury, explaining that Brian had violently pinned and pressed her body up against the rigid wood and fiberglass backing of the sailboat's cabin while wrapping his hands around her throat. This is the point where we must open the floor to you, the audience who has followed this tragedy from the very beginning. When you hear about a documented history of strangulation, paired with a suspect who has a proven background in manipulating GPS data, does it leave any room in your mind for the theory of a tragic maritime accident? Or does it paint the clear, undeniable picture of an escalation that finally reached its breaking point in the isolated waters of the Bahamas? Drop your theories and your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice helps keep the pressure on these agencies to ensure this case does not slide into obscurity. The reality that Lynette's mother, Darlene, has had to face is a burden that no parent should ever have to carry. Darlene has since revealed that Lynette actually left Brian multiple times, packing her bags and fleeing the sailboat in a desperate bid for survival, only to be drawn back by the complex, psychological cycle of abuse that traps so many victims. Darlene was so consumed by fear for her daughter's life that she spent hours consulting with professional battered women's shelters, pleading with experts to give her the right words, the right strategy, to convince Lynette to stay away from the vessel for good. But the hold was too strong, and Lynette went back one final time. 2 weeks before her death, in a moment of clarity, Lynette purchased a one-way airline ticket scheduled for March 11th, a ticket that was meant to be her final escape. She never got to use it, and as the dive teams descend back into the water, the true weight of what happened in those final 2 weeks is finally coming to light. The timeline leading up to that fateful March 11th airline ticket reveals a calculated pattern of isolation that federal prosecutors are now assembling into a formal timeline of intent. When a victim of domestic violence makes the definitive decision to buy a plane ticket, the dynamic within the household shifts from volatile to highly dangerous. Security experts know that the most perilous moment for any abused spouse is the exact window when they attempt to physically leave their abuser. Investigators believe Brian discovered that digital airline confirmation on Lynette's phone, triggering a final, explosive confrontation within the absolute isolation of the soulmate. This wasn't an accidental slip into the ocean during a midnight boat ride. It was a crisis that had been building for months, hidden away from the world behind the fiberglass hull of a yacht anchored in a foreign harbor. The Coast Guard Investigative Service is now focusing heavily on the physical geometry of the sailboat's interior cabin, looking for microscopic blood spatter or signs of a structural repair that might indicate Brian tried to bleach or scrub the wood paneling after the fact. Even if a suspect uses industrial cleaners, modern forensic science utilizes chemical compounds that bond with the iron in human hemoglobin, causing it to glow under specialized light spectrums even after multiple washings. This is exactly why the vessel was hauled out of the water and placed into a secure federal dry dock facility, to prevent the natural washing action of the bilge water from destroying the final, silent witness to Lynette's final moments. Think about that for a moment and ask yourself why Brian's initial legal defense team was so eager to keep the boat in Bahamian hands rather than allowing it to be towed into American territory. They knew that once that vessel crossed into the legal boundary of a U.S. federal agency, the entire standard of investigation would change from a localized accident inquiry into a high-stakes forensic homicide processing operation. The contrast between how local authorities handled the scene and how the Coast Guard is handling it now is night and day. Stay with me because this is where the details of Brian's past legal battles introduce a shocking layer of context that changes how we view his entire psychological profile. Long before he met Lynette, Brian stood before a criminal jury, facing charges for an act of violence that mirrors this case in a way that is utterly terrifying. He was put on trial for allegedly wrapping his hands around the throat of his own 12-year-old daughter and choking her during a fit of rage. During that trial, multiple eyewitnesses took the stand, delivering under oath descriptions of a man who would completely lose control of his faculties when challenged. Yet, Brian's defense team managed to secure an acquittal by deploying a highly controversial psychological defense strategy, arguing to the jury that the young girl's memories had been artificially implanted by bitter family members during a contentious custody dispute. While a legal acquittal means he cannot be tried again for that specific act, it does not erase the historical reality of the testimony, nor does it change the chilling fact that his daughter completely severed all communication with him from that day forward, choosing to live in total estrangement rather than remain anywhere near her father. When you look at the allegations Lynette made to her mother about being choked to the point of losing consciousness, the structural parallels between his past and his present are impossible to ignore. It suggests a deeply ingrained behavioral mechanism, a specific way of enforcing compliance and silence through physical asphyxiation. The defense will undoubtedly argue that past allegations are completely irrelevant to what happened in the Sea of Abaco, but in the court of public opinion and within the strategic planning rooms of federal agencies, it establishes a clear, predictable pattern of escalating domestic terror. It tells investigators exactly what kind of physical trauma they should be looking for if they manage to recover Lynette's remains from the ocean floor. The human hyoid bone, a tiny U-shaped structure in the neck, almost always fractures during an act of fatal manual strangulation, serving as an indelible signature of homicide that water, time, and depth cannot erase. This brings us to the specific underwater anomaly that has drawn the Margaret Norville and its specialized remote-operated vehicles back to the coordinates surrounding Tulu Cut. Local fishermen and divers have long known that the topography of the Sea of Abaco is filled with deep blue holes, jagged limestone drop-offs, and underwater caves where the current creates a powerful downward suction during tidal shifts. Dean Zamzile, the local resident whose shoreline surveillance cameras captured the eerie light activity aboard the Soulmate on the night of the disappearance, pointed investigators toward a highly specific underwater shelf that plunges abruptly to a depth of 40 feet. This isn't a wide-open, sandy bottom where an object can be easily spotted from the surface. It is a complex, dark marine ecosystem filled with shifting silt and coral formations. If a body was intentionally weighted down using a heavy, pink dive belt, it wouldn't float at the surface or wash ashore with the wind. It would sink directly into these deep limestone pockets, becoming trapped beneath the rocky ledges. The ROV currently deployed by the Coast Guard is equipped with high-definition sonar arrays capable of penetrating through layers of loose sand and marine debris, looking for the specific density of metallic weights and human skeletal structures. This is the moment where we need to turn the conversation over to you, the community that has refused to let Lynette's name be forgotten. When you look at this mountain of circumstantial data, the airline ticket, the history of domestic strangulation trials, the targeted underwater search for a missing weight belt, do you believe federal prosecutors already have enough to secure an indictment, or do they absolutely need to find physical remains to close the trap on Brian Hooker? Drop your insights and your theories in the comments section below, because the legal distinction between a bodiless homicide prosecution and a traditional case is one of the most complex battlegrounds in modern criminal law. If you feel that Lynette's daughter, Carly, and her mother, Darlene, deserve to see the full weight of federal justice brought down on whoever is responsible for this tragedy, please take a quick second to share this video across your social media platforms and subscribe to the channel. Your active engagement ensures that this story remains at the forefront of investigative reporting, sending a clear message that the public is watching every move the Coast Guard makes in those Bahamian waters. The narrative is no longer drifting helplessly. It is locking into place with a terrifying precision, and as we prepare to look at the final, missing pieces of Brian's midnight timeline, the window for excuses is slammed firmly shut.